Okay, let's jump right into this explainer and explore the sweeping, fascinating history of the United States. We're going to look at this epic story through a very specific lens: the incredible tension between America's founding ideals and its historical realities. It's a story of soaring principles, harsh truths, and a constant, evolving struggle to align the two. So I want you to think about this question as we go. Most nations throughout history were formed around a shared ethnicity, a geographical boundary, or, a monarch. But America attempted something radically different. Today, we're going to trace thousands of years of history on the North American continent to uncover the true story of how that single idea played out in reality.
All right, Section 1, the road to revelation.
To really ground ourselves, we have to start 15,000 years ago, when the first indigenous peoples arrived, eventually building these vast, highly sophisticated societies across the continent. Fast forward a bit to 1492. Christopher Columbus makes landfall, kicking off intense European colonization. By 1607, the English established Jamestown. But 1619 marks a pivotal, deeply tragic moment. The first enslaved Africans arrive in Virginia, laying the foundation for centuries of slavery. The timeline then brings us to 1754 and the French and Indian War, an event that sets the stage for a massive geopolitical shift. Following that French and Indian War, the British crown was left staring at massive war debts. Their bright idea? Saddle the American colonies with new taxes, like the Stamp Act, without giving them a single voice in Parliament. This cry of no taxation without representation wasn't just some catchy political slogan. It sparked a genuine constitutional outrage. The colonists had been governing themselves for over a century, and suddenly their fundamental rights were being stripped away. This outrage would forever change history. Moving to Section 2, the American mind. According to analysis from the Heritage Foundation, the colonists' revolutionary spirit wasn't just about paying extra taxes on tea. It was deeply philosophical. It was shaped by a really rich blend of Christian morality, a deep reverence for the British Constitution, and the powerful ideas of Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke. Basically, they were drawing on centuries of thought to articulate a brand new vision of human liberty. Just listen to this quote from George Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights in 1776. It captures that core philosophy of natural law perfectly. It's the profound, earth-shattering idea that rights are inherent to human beings simply because they are human. They aren't privileges handed down by a king or a government, they're yours by nature. So here is the absolutely crucial takeaway. When we look at the Declaration of Independence, the colonists' specific grievances against King George III were actually a blueprint. When they complained about him refusing assent to laws, they were protesting the suppression of self-governance. When they called out the suspending of legislatures, they were defending representative democracy. And protesting the quartering of soldiers, that was laying the groundwork for protecting property and privacy rights. These grievances directly translated into the constitutional rights we hold dear today. Section 3, a house divided.
Now, the story absolutely does not end with the founding. We have to explore the explosive dissonance between those soaring ideals we just talked about and the harsh realities of a rapidly growing nation. As the United States expanded westward, it completely contradicted its founding principles. Through policies like the Indian Removal Act of the 1830s, the government forced the violent relocation of Native American tribes. Simultaneously, the nation grew a booming cotton economy in the Deep South that was entirely, brutally dependent on human bondage. The hypocrisy of this expansion was staggering.
By 1830, there were over 2 million enslaved people in the United States. 2 million. When you place that staggering number next to the phrase, all men are created equal, the contradiction is just devastating. It was the defining original sin of the American nation, a crisis of conscience that tore at the very fabric of the country. And the ultimate cost of failing to live up to the Declaration's ideals? The American Civil War. It was the deadliest conflict in American history, claiming over 600,000 lives. The nation quite literally ripped itself apart over the issue of slavery, testing whether a nation conceived in liberty could long endure. But out of that horrific bloodshed came a mandate for change. Through the Emancipation Proclamation and eventually the 13th Amendment, President Abraham Lincoln forced the nation to undergo what he famously called a new birth of freedom. This was a monumental pivot, finally aligning the nation's laws far closer to its founding principles of liberty and equality. Which brings us to Section 4, the struggle for equality. Because even after the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, true equality was fiercely resisted. Systemic segregation was quickly engineered in the South through brutal Jim Crow laws, delaying justice for nearly a century. This made the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s not just a protest, but an absolute necessity to force the country to honor its founding documents.
I absolutely love this quote. In 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. brilliantly used the founders' own words to expose the hypocrisy of segregation. Standing in front of the Lincoln Memorial, he referred to the Declaration of Independence as a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. He demanded that the nation finally cash the check written in 1776, proving that those founding ideals still held immense power to drive social change.
And you know, this exact same philosophical anchor was used even earlier at the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848. Figures like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Frederick Douglass demanded women's suffrage by modeling their arguments directly on the Declaration of Independence. They recognized that the logic of 1776, that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, must absolutely apply to women as well. Finally, Section 5, the modern debate. Bringing this all to the present day, we see that the story of America's origin isn't just history. It is still fiercely, passionately debated right now. Today, there are two very prominent, contrasting narratives. On one hand, perspectives like those from the Heritage Foundation argue for the 1776 narrative, viewing America's true unifying origin as those founding ideals of liberty and equality. On the other hand, the 1619 Project narrative argues that the nation is fundamentally rooted in the legacy of slavery and systemic racism. As an explainer, our goal isn't to pick a side here, but to understand that this very tension is absolutely central to modern American discourse. Furthermore, this debate extends to the role of government itself. The Heritage Foundation notes that modern progressive interpretations, like President Barack Obama's statement in his second inaugural address that preserving our individual freedoms ultimately requires collective action, represent a real philosophical shift. They observe that this shifts the focus from individual liberty towards collective, state-driven action, which they argue drifts away from the founders' original vision of limited government. So, as we approach the nation's 250th anniversary, I want to leave you with this provocative thought. The American experiment is unfinished. It is a continuous, often painful, but deeply inspiring journey to bridge the gap between our realities and our ideals. How will the next chapter of that promissory note be written? That ultimately is up to all of us. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.